Okay, I think we are good to start. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for one of our speakers, but I think because of time, we have to start now. So, colleagues, I want to welcome you to this donor dialogue on bridging science and policy for sustainable agri-food systems that has been co-convened under StepForce Consortium. If you don't know, StepForce is a project funded by the Horizon Europe, and it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Daniel Adeniyi, and I'm a policy analyst at ECDPM. And so we are delighted to have you join this conversation today. I think it's timely that we have this conversation, especially in light of upcoming events like the AU Agricultural Ministerial that is scheduled to take place on Friday, as well as the UN Food System stock taking, which will happen also very soon. And so it's a crucial opportunity for us to reflect on donor institutions and how they are strengthening science policy linkages and how they are scaling the impact of research and innovation, especially in African food systems. So I want to welcome everyone to this session. And without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Stephen Onakushe, who is the immediate past president of AgriNatura, to officially open the session. Dr. Onakushe, over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Stephen, the immediate past president of AgriNatura. I welcome you all to this very good gathering where we'll be talking about the impact of or how donors can best link science to policy and social impact in Africa's system. Today, we discuss across discipline and sectors, and one thing is clear: the transformation of Africa's food system depends not just on what we do, but how we act on what we know. This is where research and innovation and robust science policy interface becomes indispensable. Across the continent, science is generating promising solutions from climate-resilient crop to digital advisory tools, from nutrition-sensitive value chain to innovation in agroecology. But this breakthrough must not stay confined in journals or pilot plots. They must shape real-world policy, investment, and programs that deliver for farmers, consumers, and environment alike. This is the core challenge and opportunity of the science policy interface to bridge the world of evidence and decision-making of discovery and delivery. In this regard, the StepForce project, which is strengthening evidence-based policy and practice for food system transformation in Africa, is a catalyst. Through its work, StepForce is leading to strengthen institutional capacity, support knowledge co-creation between researchers and policymakers, and illuminate pathways for scaling what works. In this case, I will argue that donors play a pivotal role in bridging these gaps. Through strategic investment, collaboration, and a focus on system thinking, donors can accelerate the translation of research into action. They can support institutions that convene science and policy analysis or work, fund data systems that inform decision, and empower local voice to shape solutions that work in context. So we must ask ourselves some questions. How can we better align donor funding with national policy priorities and science evidence? Again, I will also ask, how can we ensure that, that research is demand-driven, inclusive, and actionable? And how can we support not just innovation, but the institutions, partners, and policies that sustain and scale them? No one single actor, government, academic, or donor can transform food system alone. This is something we are all aware of. But together, through collaboration and anchored in evidence and driven by shared purpose, we can support the transition to resilient, equitable, and nutrition-sensitive food system across Africa. And this is something I believe AgriNatura over the past years have been running through and have been doing in collaboration, thanks to DG IMPA and all the other DGs that have been supporting this kind of systems or research thinking. So once again, I say welcome. And thank you for being part of this vital roundtable discussion. So I will be eager to hear and read from what a lot of you will be saying in this roundtable discussion. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Onakushet, for that important remarks. I think it is apt. And I'd like to move forward now. We're still expecting one of the presenters who was supposed to give the opening remarks on behalf of the DPCG, but he's not here, and also on behalf of ALDA. So without wasting too much or taking a lot of our time, I'll want to invite Professor Joachim van Bron, who is a professor at the Center of Development Research, ZEF in Bonn, and a leading voice on the science policy interface in food systems, to give his keynote speech. Professor Van Bron will share reflections on the state of research and innovation in African food systems and the persistent challenges and opportunities in aligning evidence with decision making. So please, over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the invitation. This is a timely session which you organize, and I look forward to the conversation. So you have asked me to discuss where are we on the science policy interface and research and innovation in Africa's food system. As already highlighted by Stephen, Africa stands at a critical juncture in transforming its food systems to ensure growth, sustainability, climate resilience, and nutrition security. So we are confronted with multiple challenges and goals. Central to this transformation is a strong cooperation between science and policy and the science policy interface, as we call it. This is critical for innovation. But there are obstacles. The SPI is only as strong as the S is, that is the science capacity and relevance for policy, and only as strong as the P is, the policy's capacity to listen, absorb, and utilize the science, and is only strong if the I, the interface, operates well, that is at low administrative burdens of interfacing. This requires to embrace related institutions as partners and to reflect the diversity of Africa's food systems and institutional ecologies. However, many African countries lack institutionalized mechanisms to connect researchers and policymakers. Short-term project cycles limit the ability to build sustained engagement. And there is limited policy demand for evidence when policymaking operates on political logic rather than empirical data or evidence. Strategies and partnerships for scaling research and innovation requires more than temporary pilot project. It demands robust partnerships across governments, academia, private sector, civil society, and regional bodies, underpinned by adequate and sustained financing. Fundamental is to build SPI and innovations on Africa's own science systems in universities and academies of science and think tanks. There is a growing, and that's the good news, and strong basis. I point to the African Research Universities Alliance, the so-called ARUA, the Regional Universities Forum for Capacity Building in Agriculture, the RU Forum, the Network of African Academies of Sciences, NASAC, and the Academy, the African Academy of Science, the Forum of Agriculture Research in Africa, FARA, and the regional networks and NARS. So we have an increasingly strong landscape, but more can be done to engage meaningfully to co-production among scientists and economists with policymakers, between African leaders and donors, which I prefer to call development partners. Practical steps can be to have more African scientists embedded temporarily in donor agencies and scientists in African governmental institutions related to the food system. Donors have played a pivotal role in building the architecture of SPI and African agri-food systems. They do so by funding research institutions mentioned above and supporting data systems. For example, programs by the CGIAR, by Academia 2063, and the Malabo Montpellier panel benefit from donor support producing research that informs food system strategies across African countries. However, the donor landscape related to food systems is rapidly changing and investment resources in agri-food are declining. To reboot the support system, donors should commit to longer-term funding models and support capacity development within governments. Donors should align funding with African frameworks, especially the Kampala Declaration, and I understand they do so. I'm sure Leonard will talk about that later on. And support for platforms that foster African Union, European Union cooperation and food systems transformation has great opportunities. The national pathways, the so-called national pathways established in the follow-up to the UN Food Systems Summit in 2021 have made some good contributions, and we look forward to the stock-taking summit in Addis Ababa end of July. Let me close with 3 policy initiatives recommended for the way forward. Number 1, learning from within Africa and from historical examples elsewhere in the world, including in Europe. The Malabo Montpellier panel does series of policy studies, 2 per year, and each case success stories can be identified in each study. Success stories can be identified in 3 or 4 African countries. So the basis for learning within Africa is there and is strong. But we need to identify these opportunities from learning within. And that requires strengthening data and monitoring systems. Secondly, promoting Africa's capacity to coordinate donor engagement through joint funding mechanisms that align with Africa-led agendas. Donors should prioritize flexible long-term funding for SPI platforms. And third, maybe most importantly, institutionalizing SPI platforms at AU level and national levels to serve as intermediaries between research and policy communities. Such platforms would warrant support by the European Union. They need clearly established rules for engagement on both sides, the science side and the policy side. SPI governance needs clear principles of legitimacy, accountability, effectiveness, and inventiveness. In conclusion, strengthening the science policy interface in African food system requires deeper partnership, and that's why I welcome this dialogue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that opening remarks, for that keynote speech. It is really important, the points that you have made in terms of promoting African capacity to coordinate donor engagement and institutionalizing SPI platforms. I think they are very important points. So, I mean, we'll now go into the panel discussion now, and we have this distinguished group of panelists here who are working at the intersection of evidence, funding, and policy engagement. And we have Federica De Gaetano here from the GDPRD. Welcome. And also we have Alan Renison from the Gates Foundation. We also have joining us for the Oshani Pereira, who is with the Shamba Center. And I'd like to start with Federica De Gaetano. Basically drawing on your experience with GDPRD and your role at the Italian permanent representative, how do you see donors best shaping and supporting the science policy interfaces that are responsive to African policy priorities? Federica. And you're muted. You have to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Sorry, I am in this moment in a conference, so I don't know if you you can hear me well or you have a noise. Sorry for that. First of all, thanks a lot for inviting me to participate to this discussion. And first of all, yes, I am a co-chair of the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development, and actually I work as a food security expert at the Italian permanent representation to EU. I think that this is a very interesting discussion, and as chemist, because I am a chemist, I can really see the point of the discussion and connection among policy and science, also has experience as in my own experience. First of all, I think that we, through the donor platform, we encourage early coordination between donors, so sharing of insight and joint positioning ahead of the key policy processes donors. Donors utilize evidence to identify critical needs, assess the effectiveness of different approach, and ensure their investment have the greatest impact. Donors also support RI, so research initiative, to generate new knowledge and innovative solution to address complex challenge. From the my feeling is that this is a very important also, and the importance of the research is recognized to the donors is in the policy as well. I can just say that for us and also for the dialogue that we had inside the platform, we convene that the donor organization making substantive investment in agriculture, rural development, food system issue, and also research in order to exchange information, discussing emerging priority issue and determine effective strategy to address them. For now, I would like to just let the others, take the floor on this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Federica, for that insight. I'd like to welcome Alan Renison from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to give his own insight. And I want to ask, over the years, we know that Gates Foundation worked a lot in agricultural systems in Africa, supporting research and innovation. And what have you learned from past attempts to connect science with policy in African agriculture? And what has worked or failed, and why have things worked, or why have you experienced even failures in those ones that you failed in?
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel, join this very important conversation around the science policy interface. So, yeah, just before I go into some of the key points that the Gates Foundation has learned with respect to connecting science and policy in Africa over the years, just a couple of words about agriculture at the Gates Foundation. So we are a big team inside the foundation with a lot of partners around the world, and our sort of what we're known for is investing in research and development of new crop and livestock technologies, and so that translation of those big investments that we've made over many years, taking the risk on R&D and translating that into adoption and impact at scale is a real concern for us, and we know that the policy enabling environment is very key to that. And we're starting to sort of evolve our thinking in terms of how we engage in policy with a specific goal motivating the scaling of these what we call our big bet innovations. So the big areas of R&D that we'll look at going forward, and that's going to relate to things like artificial intelligence enabled advisory services, new biotech technologies, livestock technologies, and so on. So in terms of your question, Daniel, and the key things that the foundation has learned, I've got a few points here, and they're quite practical observations. So I'll start with the need to speak the language of ministries of finance, right? So when we talk about scaling innovations, we need to make sure that we're building the case for the scaling of those innovations by articulating the development case in a language that ministries of finance speak. So that might involve converting the science of kind of productivity and yields into jobs and growth and tax revenues and foreign exchange and food prices and the other big kind of macroeconomic considerations that a Ministry of Finance, who might be paying or part subsidizing the scaling of something, we have to translate the science into that kind of language. And also on the private sector side, we want to, obviously, as other speakers have said, we want to motivate private investment into scaling up innovative technologies. And so the case for loosening regulations or creating institutions or new public investments to enable that private investment, again, you have to be speaking the language that resonates with a government. So that's one. Another piece is clarifying the underlying economics of the adoption of new technologies. So there's a need for new innovations to basically outperform incumbent technologies on things like yield, of course, unit cost of production, which is related to yields, but profitability. Not just for farmers, but also for the domestic SMEs who might be buying produce from farmers. And so there's a need to make sure that we're promoting technologies that have not just yield advantage, but profit advantage over the incumbent technologies. Sometimes we're a little guilty of kind of being overly focused on the innovation, but with breakthrough science, but it might not necessarily outperform what's already in farmers' hands. And it's also important to think about, again, back to sort of public investment level in that conversation with ministries of finance, what investments you might be displacing. So in the current climate, there's real headwinds in terms of ODA. Debt commitments are mounting, so fiscal resources for governments to be subsidizing the scaling of something if subsidy is required are very limited. And so, when we're pushing for more public investment in a particular technology, that's going to displace resources from some other priority. So there's an important need to just be very conscious of what you might be displacing when building that case for public investment. And then another important consideration, and our team at the foundation has really struggled with this over many years, is collecting data when you're piloting a new technology or developing a new technology. It's tempting to focus on effectiveness, but not necessarily cost effectiveness at scale. So there's an important role for the science community to be collecting the data that the private sector or governments will one day need to inform their scaling decisions, right? We do focus extensively on the science, which is very, very important, but we're not so good at focusing on what information will be required to inform that scaling decision in the future. And a good case example that we're working on right now at the Gates Foundation is in women's empowerment in agriculture. So we have lots of data on the effectiveness of different interventions, but we're not so good on the cost effectiveness of those interventions, particularly if there's innovations that need to be scaled that are not, a well-financed international NGO, but a rather poorly resourced government doing something at scale. So that some of that effectiveness will drop away, the unit costs will differ. So there's that need to really be focused on collecting data to inform scaling from the outset. And then another piece is just policy risk in general. So there's quite a a tendency for at least the foundation and I think other donors to focus on the technology risk, but there's the policy risks as well, and they can be very, very varied and very kind of diffuse, not necessarily obvious at the outset, not necessarily obvious to the science community. So doing sort of deep diagnostics on what potential future policy, regulatory, legal, institutional, fiscal risks are in advance of even the development of the technologies while the science is doing its thing, that's also extremely important. And finding a way to prioritize those risks, and again tying it back to creating the case for addressing policy barriers to governments. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, and this has been touched on by other partners here, is building local capacity to engage in the analytics and developing the case for scaling innovative technologies, alleviating policy barriers, and articulating the net trade-offs and benefits associated with the scaling of these better technologies. And with that, I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Helen, for those insightful comments. I mean, for instance, what you said around the market profit-driven innovation is really, really important. I mean, we need to basically understand the market. When you say you want to innovate and you don't understand the market and it's not market-driven, then maybe that's where sometimes we run into challenges of innovation not being scalable, and sometimes they are not market ready, as it were. And another thing that you spoke about policy risk, and I think this is why this conversation is really very important, trying to bridge the gap between the innovators and the policy makers. Because if you just continue to innovate without paying attention to, and maybe even carrying them along the policymakers and trying to understand the policy landscape and how that can actually evolve, then sometimes you could run into problems, regulatory challenges and all of that. So thank you for those insightful comments. I'd like to then give the floor now to Oshani Pereira, who works with Shamba Center. And my question to you is that we know that Shamba Center is renowned for trying to highlight what donor financing is doing and how donor financing can be more catalytic in terms of driving food systems transformation. So from your recent work, what lessons have you learned that maybe you want to bring to the fore for us here, and in terms of scaling innovation in African food systems?
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Oshani Pereira. I'm co-founder at the Shamba Center for Food and Climate. We're relatively a new organization in the space, even though the founder, Karen Smaller, is an institutional name in food and agriculture policy. The Shamba Center has been grappling with the question on science, policy, and finance for the last 3 years. To ride on what Alan just said, we have that conversation every day, meaning this is what the science is showing, how do we bring it to policy? And then policymakers are saying that's not the science we want when we look at what our countries need and what our voters are interested in. We've just completed a part of a large program at the Shamba Center called HISAT 2030, where we've been doing evidence synthesis and bringing evidence to bear on nutrition policy. Karen just completed a few presentations to stakeholders around the G7 on it. And right now we are conducting a similar analysis on climate. And I shall start there. Because when we look at donor finance, and maybe Daniel, if it's possible to look at some of the slides, please. We look at the question firstly on debt. And the first slide, if we can have a look at it, brings this to bear in the donor countries, where we see debt to GDP ratios in the donor countries to be well over the 100% percentile. And therefore, when we look at this debt, there is something that we never discuss in these forums, which is that 84% of OECD government debt comes from securities in the market. 13.5% of them come from loans, and 2.5% come from currency deposits. So if 80% of donor countries' debt is from securities in financial markets, that means that the donor countries themselves are at mercy of the markets. And that gives a very different lens to how we might view overseas development assistance and the potential decline of overseas development assistance into the next 5 to 10 years. The second fault line that we observe is the carbon budget. Last week, we had the International Panel on Climate Change tell us that under the 1.5 degree scenario, we have 3 years of the carbon budget left. That means that we need 1.5 trillion additional climate financing. That's a lot of money. And how do we raise that is a big question. Here's a slide on the European Union debt. I'll give you a minute to look at it. Remembering 84% of this debt is raised on financial markets. And the next slide, Daniel, please, is the carbon budget. So you see the last line on this great chart showing you where we are, that we have pretty much 3 years left on the 1.5 degree scenario, on which most of our planning is based. And then there are 2 instruments here. Again, I ride on what Alan said. There are 2 instruments here when we look at financing. One is blending, and the next slide is on blending. This means making the best use of every donor dollar, which is our platinum currency. Okay, here's what we see on the potential for blending over 2022 and 2024. So here the news is good because it does show that in agriculture, there is certainly more potential to blend, more need for us to begin to translate the science of agriculture and food systems into financial language. That need is really paramount. And then the next way we can raise money is through the markets. And here we look at carbon pricing. And the next slide, please, Daniel. I'm sorry about the quality of this slide. This slide shows you how we can raise money and where money is being raised around carbon pricing. We have the emission trading systems, we have the carbon taxes, and we have credit mechanisms. And here where we see that development in Africa is nascent. And unless these markets are in place, we can't get to that sum, that beta that Alan would need when you look at the pricing of technologies and you look and how to price political risks and commercial risks and financing risks. Professor Von Braun talked to us about the need to have platforms where we can have price discovery and risk discovery. This puts that into a finance perspective. This slide puts that into a finance perspective. And finally, the last slide shows us again where the credit markets are, because the credits are important. If you want to put innovative big bets from the Gates Foundation into the market, we also need the credit markets to work to reward mitigation, to reward productivity, to reward cost efficiency. And here again, what we're seeing is that the credit markets in the countries where they're most needed are nascent. And I'll leave it there, because here is the space where we badly need long-term financing that is tied to a result and to an outcome. Thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded my 5 minutes.
Thank you, Shani. I mean, I think it's really important what you've shared, in that we need to be innovative when we talk about financing food systems. And I'm glad also Leonard is here. I'm going to call on him later, because he always says that we need to be innovative. Where is the money going to come from? Given the challenges that we have in the world now and the shrinking ODA budget, we need to, and I think your presentation actually speaks to that. And I mean, the map that you showed of Africa and where the carbon credits, where it's being utilized, you see a lot of gaps despite the huge potential that we have there. And there is also potential for agroforestry that is not being tapped really intensely enough. And so this needs to be looked into critically. Thanks for that, Ushani. I want to then return to Federica now and ask a follow-up question. And I want to say that based on your coordination work at the GDRPD, what kind of partnerships have actually helped you to translate evidence into policy outcomes? And where do you see the gaps that are still evident presently?
Yes, thanks a lot for the question. So first of all, I would like to say that some of the main barriers include, of course, fragmentation of funding, poor coordination between research and policymaker, and the lack of incentive to translate evidence into action. Political cycles and capacity constraint also play a role. Donors can help by investing in knowledge brokering, supporting platforms that facilitate ongoing dialogue between scientists and policymakers, and harmonizing funding strategy to avoid duplication and maximize impact. Donors must also be responsive to what countries and national government needs, not just what the global agenda wants to offer. As some of you already highlight, I mean, I also, yes, can mention initiative like 50 for 2013, SRS 2030, that are good examples where donors supported evidence that has fed directly into decision-making framework. Evidence generation should be demanding like demand driving, like embedded in local policy cycles and sustained beyond the life of the single project. Concerning in particular the work that we have been done into within the Global Donor Platform for Rural Development, we can, we for example, I would like to really underline the work that we have been done with the working group of the innovative finance and blended finance, that is also a very important issue that starts, we can say, like last year, also launched, this kind of theme was launched also by the Italian presidency, G7 presidency last year. And now we have this kind of priorities. And in the light of this priority, I wanted to underline the development of a white paper titled Financing Agri-Food System for People, Planet and Prosperity, that was developed under the guidance of a high-level advisor group. And the white papers makes the case for agri-food system to become a top-tier investment priority. It calls for a new pact to mobilize capital at scale, reform investment system, and align finance with the long-term transformation goals. Further, the other group within the Global Donor Platform, we have different kind of thematic work focused in any case strongly on Africa, and we have rural youth employment, the one on land, and the SDG 2 roadmap that in this case was particularly relevant because yes, there was some interlinkage with the CERES 2030 and the initiative 50 for 2030. So just to underline some kind of important work that we are doing in order to let the donors speak each other, to be really informal, importance to have this kind of informal networking among donors, and to find the gap and the possibility to improve this kind of the interconnection among science and policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federica. You've highlighted a very important point in saying that sometimes there is fragmentation of funding, and some suggestions that were brought to the fore is also, they are very important in terms of coordination and even informal networking or informal engagement. And this, I think we have the DPCG, some DPCG members are here. We also have even the GTPLD, where you can actually try and coordinate a little what these the donor institutions are doing. And I want to then turn back to Alan now. You spoke in your first comment or round of comments around risk taking, and I want to then ask you, as Gates Foundation, how do you balance innovation risk taking with the need for scale and policy alignment? I think you've mentioned the issues around even policy risk and all of that. So how do you, of course, you need to innovate and continue to do this. How do you then balance it, or how have you been envisaging it within Gates Foundation, or what other recommendations do you have for all of us here?
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, so in terms of the Foundation's sort of experience in terms of balancing innovation risk taking and that crucial need for policy alignment and ultimately scaling. So the Foundation, as I was mentioning earlier, we're very happy to take the risk on technology development. You know, we can invest in ways that others can't. We've got a very sort of long and deep focus on research and development, on livestock and on crop agriculture, and so that's kind of, you know, it's a place that we're very well established. But alongside that, in recent years, and an area of work that I'm engaged in quite deeply is the development of economic modeling tools that governments can use to assess the trade-offs associated with a whole range of different public investments and policy choices. But that includes investment in R&D at the national level and in investment in the scaling of technology. So as we're sort of all very aware, there's some big policy objectives that governments need to try and deliver via their food system, ranging from poverty reduction, food security, growth, dietary improvement, women's empowerment, climate adaptation, job creation. And they've got many policy instruments with which to try to address those or deliver those policy objectives, many different technology options for increasing productivity, which is at the heart of the delivery of any of these policy objectives. And so we've been investing in the development of economic modelling tools that will help governments assess these trade-offs, right? Limited fiscal envelope, limited delivery capacity, realities on the ground in terms of consumption preferences and demand for different commodities, and increasing climate risk, increasing frequency of global market shocks, price shocks, and so on. So economic modelling is becoming very important for assessing all these trade-offs and making hard decisions about the scaling of scientific breakthrough technologies. Now, models are not the be-all and end-all, right? They're not a crystal ball. They're not going to give you the answer. You have to make those decisions yourself as a government if there's a need for subsidy for the scaling of something, and so that they don't displace the need for public consultation, engaging with the private sector, engaging with farmers and so on, but they are a good way of structuring the data and structuring the case for public investment. So it's that balance of investing in the technology development itself, plus increasingly on the kind of economics and the trade-offs, and we put economic modelling at the heart of that, and economists, so the technical assistance to interpret modelling results, to run models, and to inform that part of the debate. And we've been investing in a range of different partners, international partners like the CGIAR and FAO, but increasingly partners on the continent, in particular the African Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, and NAPRI is becoming a very important partner for the foundation. And then just one final point is identifying exemplar countries. So we're always and we do this on the health side at the Gates Foundation. So identifying countries around the world that have made good progress on some of the key sort of macro indicators. So it could be childhood stunting, it could be the status of the primary healthcare system, it could be different indicators. And so we're starting to look at that in agriculture with a specific focus on where countries have invested in R&D, where they're making progress on total factor productivity, and what policy choices those governments have made, and to what extent those policy lessons can be transferred to different countries on the continent. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that. I think it's really important what you spoke about, and we can even begin to make connections, right? Because when we started this event, we actually mentioned StepForce, and there is, as part of StepForce, there is PANAP also, which StepForce actually is trying to strengthen. And PANAP is what they do is basically around economic analysis of policies. And so we have in Africa, we do a lot of work around modeling also, for instance, looking at the economic impact of continental frameworks such as the AFCFTA, and there are modeling tools that we are using, and some of our colleagues are also here, Demetra modeling, CG modeling, and so it's good to make some of these connections, and maybe there could be follow-ups with Gates Foundation around this. Thank you for your contribution, which I think it's really important. I want to turn back before we start with the open discussion and give the floor to our participants. I just want to hear again from Oshani and ask this critical question, really about financing, or what are the most important financing or coordination gaps that you have seen, and as we are looking forward to major moments like the AU Agricultural Ministerial and the UNFSS Stocktake moment. What are those gaps that are still there that we need to address, and how do you think we can go about addressing these gaps?
Thank you, Daniel. Well, the reality is that as we move towards a 1.7 climate world, implementation across the agri-food system is going to become more expensive because the climate uncertainties will play out in such a way that it will be more expensive. I can give you just a little example from Europe, from Northern Europe. Though the winter has been so mild and so wet, it hardly snows anymore, so that there's so much water in the ground across Northern Europe right now. It makes it very difficult to plow and to plant, because a lot of the soils around Denmark, in the UK, I'm speaking from Ireland, around here, have a lot of water content in it. That means the whole agriculture sector in Northern Europe is really facing front-end climate risk. In that reality, I would like to put three potential ways where we can make best use of donor funding. The first one is to support cutting-edge technology and to support better investment in sciences in our countries. Maybe we need to look at a viability gap fund that makes risky but technologically potential full projects cheaper to implement. The second solution could be learning what the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is doing currently with the support of the EU, is something called an unfunded guarantee, meaning that donors guarantee a part of the performance risk, a part of the climate risk, a part of the political risks, but that money is not put aside into a pot and kept safely in case there is a risk. That money remains on the balance sheets of the donor governments, and the donor governments can release that money in case it's needed. It's an easier way for donors who are themselves in a debt crisis to take a part of the responsibility for food and agriculture into the future, for investment in science and technology into the next 10 years. And the third one is to change the way we work, and that is something at the Schumber Center we are incubating right now, is to change the rhetoric from activities. We are going to train 100 farmers, for example. We're going to roll out 6 different models of an AI-informed weather app, drawing from what Alan said, for example. Instead of doing that, what if he said, we want to remain in a 1.6 scenario. We want the carbon budget kept per capita at a particular level. We want carbon sequestered at a given volume. We want biodiversity increased to a particular threshold. And if we change the way we view things, will money flow differently? Question mark. And at the Schumber Center, we're playing around with an outcome financing idea that moves money in this direction. And will this bring about the changes that we need? And will this bring about a way for us to envisage this long-term and flexible financing that Professor Van Braun opened the meeting with? And that will again set aside what Alan wants to see, a reduction in the political risks so he can take more technology risks going forward.
Great, thank you for those reflections. I think they are important. Flexible financing, long-term financing, they are really, really important. And for us to really achieve this, we need more coordination, more donor coordination to get to this. Now it's time to open the floor for participants in the call to really actually also engage. Maybe you have a clarification to make or you have comments to make. I think, and then I'll first of all give the floor to Leonard, who is with DG IMPA, to speak to some of these things and to give his reaction or takeaway to some of these things that he has heard today. Yes, please, Leonard.
Okay, so thanks a lot. And Daniel, I find this extremely useful. And thanks also to the Shamba Center, to Professor von Braun, to Ellen, and to Federica. With Federica, we are in weekly meetings in the Global Donor Platform. I just arrived from Berlin, Joachim. I was at the Policies Against Hunger. And for me, and tomorrow we go to the EU-AU Ministerial, where the topic of agriculture research will also be discussed. I will be participating myself in the PANUP side event. And I think what was said both by Ellen and Oshan in particular, I think is important, because there are key facts out there which can't be sort of easily resolved. ODA space is going and risk shrinking. We'll see what comes out from SEVI. Everyone speaks about innovative finance, and we can do all the tricks of the trade. Things will not go easily in the most fragile contexts, where most of the research needs to land. So the research state of the EU within the Common Agricultural Policy is pretty robust. But when you come to the Sahel or to the EGAT countries, good luck. And that is an issue. We can't forget the fragile context. So I'll come up with a bit, not solutions, but a bit of a pathway. First of all, and with the likes of the Shamba, with the likes of the core donor community, we have these discussions almost systematically in G7, G20. Today's world of 2025 is a different world than of 10, 15 years ago. With a disengagement of the US, there is a big gap. And let's be clear and honest, that gap can't be filled up just by the EU. I haven't heard much about the role of the South-South or South-North trilateral cooperation in terms of solutions. It can't just be the EU, or it can't just be Gates to fill up some gaps. I was in touch yesterday also with Brazil, the potential of Embrapa, you know, the potential of India, 1.3 billion with a big capacity in terms of also agricultural development, which is embedded also by big subsidies. So that is, I think, something to reconcile of what, because we speak global North, global South, some don't like that terminology. Global South need also to help global South. It can't just be the old donors. So that is a fact, and that can't just be put aside. Then it's a question of rationalization. You know, we support through Forum, we support FARA, we support GFAR, we support loads of platforms. The question is, these are relatively small ticket sizes in terms of global public goods, and we risk that global public goods are going to shrink in space. Why? Because most of the funds are geographized now, so the landing has to be geographic, which means that technically It's our partners, it's our geographical African Union partners. Let's speak about the CAADP domesticization. Joachim, yesterday I was with the German, both Agriculture Ministry and BMZ and GIZ to discuss exactly what we can do, hopefully also in Team Europe, on the domesticization of the CAADP agenda. For those who are in the CAADP agenda, we know that in 20 years, there is some progress, but not the progress that was initially foreseen. And we are in 2025 with a new CAADP agenda in more dire straits in terms of challenges ahead. But let's speak about what can we do in the CAADP domesticization agenda. Clearly, more streamlining and prioritization. We can't just do a bit of everything. And yes, I fully agree with Ellen. AI, digital, no problem. But the question is, can we do everything at scale with all the challenges we have? I'll give you an example. On One Health, transboundary animal diseases, we try to do a bit of scaling up on the eradication of pest Dipiterumina. There has not been an eradication of a disease, an animal disease, since rinderpest. We are trying to work on PPR. Traction on that is very limited. No appetite from financial institutions and from many donors. It's what we call a nice to have for many. Others will say, for me, the most important is fertilizer production rather than soil health and fertilizer production. So the question is, what can we do both on fertilizers, soil health, soil mapping at scale? Speaking to Maximo Torero and others, there is a big problem on data. Okay, FuseNet are back in business, but there is a gap on data. So the question is, how can we address that data analysis gap so that we get the hunger hotspots and the report that we do on the global network in terms of the data gaps to do the evidence? Because without data, we can't do the evidence. The issue is around what I call the geopolitics of technology. No one mentioned, but there is a problem of geopolitics of technology. My technology, which is agroecology approach, might not be appetizing to some. Others will want a high-tech, high-productivity, GMO type of technology. And that is a geopolitics of technology. And partners can pick and choose, but there is a political narrative on the geopolitics of technology. Discussions with Kenya in terms of use of pesticides, use of inputs, typology in terms of fertilizers, and how to have what I would call not only a country-driven agenda, but a continental and direct-driven agenda, because we can't just work around 5-10 countries, what I would call the gazelles of Africa. But if you want to have those 55 countries to blend in an African continental free trade area, you need to create those conditions to have true, robust, predictable intra-regional trade. That doesn't exist at the speed and the scale we want because trade is distorted. No one mentioned repurposing of subsidies. You can't discuss technology research if you don't discuss repurposing of smart subsidies in a smart way when you have indebtedness and limited resources. That political space or that policy dialogue space doesn't really exist in a systemic way. That is the precondition to have a science policy interface discussion, which is at the continental level. It's not happening, and it has to start in earnest because the money space, especially climate finance, is not there. So what I would suggest is that in view, and this was mentioned, we'll try to be as, I would say, constructive also in view of SEVI. Let's see what comes out of SEVI. That is, I think, an indicator of the appetite also of the financial institutions, because most of the transitioning has to come not from public money, but from financial institutions, de-risking instruments, and also the private sector, and how to de-risk the private sector. Then we have the UN Food System Summit, and also with Germany and other member states, we're discussing to have a bit of templates where the countries, maybe 10, 15 countries like Mauritania, Cameroon, Sierra Leone, but also fragile contexts like Madagascar and others, what we can do, and Chad, what we can do at scale in terms of typology of interventions. However, prioritization becomes key. We can't just do cocoa in some countries or coffee in others. The traction is clear on agroforestry in cocoa, in coffee, where we have regulatory processes like EUDR and CSDDD, which is on due diligence, that the traction exists there. But we also know that there is a strong traction on agropastoralism. Appetite there is limited. On the water, land, and peace security nexus, where there is a gap, but also on oceans and blue economy. Even there is a big gap. We came out from Nice, and there isn't big money on the blue economy dynamics. Okay, we as European Union have tried to show leadership, but still the gaps are significant. And we also try to show leadership in nutrition for growth with a Team Europe of 6 billion, but even there, the nutrition, diverse diets portfolio can't just fall into the cracks. That needs also to be a top priority, because child and maternal health is very vulnerable, especially these days. So if we can discuss and agree with our partners what are our priorities, a sequencing plan of what is doable short, medium, long term, then hopefully we can have this predictability of financing. But as you know, even in the European Union, we have cycles of financing. The next cycle starts in 2028, and the big battle starts on the 16th of July with the unveiling of the proposal. And we know where the wind is blowing in terms of priorities. So it's important also that we as community make a case why it's a long-term investment, also from a peace, security, military point of view, to invest in food and resilient food systems, so that political makers, policymakers, politicians, and taxpayers see a return on investment on what we want to do in terms of research and innovation in food systems. Over.
Thank you, Leonard, for that. I think what you said it's really important, in that we should not only make a business case for food systems transformation, the political case is also very important, and maybe this is being underemphasized, like what you talked about, the geopolitics of technology. Right? My reaction to that is and also it's for the science community, in that sometimes there is an underappreciation of the political economy context, and so there is insufficient political economy framing in terms of maybe, so sometimes you have technologically sound recommendations and innovations and all of that, but like it's not sometimes not politically visible, and so engagement with the politicians, with the policymakers, I think it's also really, really important. And just like you have said, prioritization will be key. We cannot do everything, so we need to prioritize. I'd like to give the floor to Togia Ferry. Pardon me if I got the spelling of your name wrong. Please, but if you can make your contributions in 2-3 minutes, I will appreciate that, given that we are
yeah, I can be even quicker. Thank you, Daniel. I think your pronouncement was very good. Thank you. Well, Togia Ferry from Norway. I think this discussion is very interesting, and I would like to add on to what Leonard said, and because there are some big challenges ahead, and we had conversations with FAO last week, and I talked to Kaveh from FAO, and we were talking about all these different initiatives for climate and food, and we're talking about almost 100 now. Different initiatives with different secretariats, and there are so many also ongoing work to coordinate all we do. And we have the upcoming meeting now in July in Addis. We also have the Agra meeting later on. and we have food security will be a part of the COP30 discussion. So there's a lot of different meeting points, but so we see that we have the meeting points, we have the initiatives, and we have some really good understanding among us about what to do and how we should coordinate. We have a lot of different programs, but I don't think coordination or even alignment is sufficient anymore, because as you have been talking about, a lot of you, is that ODA is drying out, and unless we are able to not only coordinate or align, but even agreeing among us what should we finance, what will be most effective, I don't think we will succeed. And those who are in lead of that will be the countries themselves, because I don't think we are able anymore to ODA fund development within the agriculture sector. And what we see as well is that the private money are going to well, some private money are going to investments, but not sufficient. And the private money coming from such as Rockefeller, Gates, and so on, are for sure going to very interesting programs and initiatives. But at the same time, they will not fund what the companies themselves are giving priority to. And you also mentioned new donors. We have seen that the Gulf countries are quite active these days, but they're not funding FAO World Food Program, IFAD. The funds are going to parallel initiatives as we see it. And my very last point goes to you, Leonard, and that's about soil health mapping, because I think we have some cooperation with. You started with Yara, the Norwegian fertilizer company, but it's a private. I would say it's turned into an NGO working with how to coordinate soil health mapping. So we can talk about that if you want later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Torgeir, for that. I'd like to call on Timo also for his own reactions. Timo, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for valuable contributions, important presentations. When I think about the link between development funding, science, and agricultural food systems in Africa, I think there's a few more things I'd like to add to the conversation. One, the point that Leonard made about fragile states is really, really important. Innovations that are profitable don't scale if they don't make sense from the user's perspective, if they don't fit in the household economics. And too often we don't include household economic analysis in our cost-benefit analysis. So we think something should work. And when you speak to households, they can't fit it into their system. I think we need to be very careful about our assumptions, and if things don't get adopted, it's often for very good reasons, and maybe we can learn from that to see what things can work, particularly in fragile contexts. The other thing is, yes, I work in the government, but I'm also a scientist at heart, and my free time I fill with science. And when I try to convince my colleagues that it's really important that we keep investing in science, the response is often quite negative. Why is that? Because the scientists that they speak to are mostly focused on their small, very important, very interesting topic, but a small topic. And that is not the thing that my colleagues are interested in. We'll need to connect all the science together in the big picture. How are we going to address the big picture? Last week, a paper was produced on yields of 6 staple crops globally under climate change, incorporating adaptation. By 2050, we're looking at an 8% loss in yields across the board. for these 6 key crops that were looked at, even with adaptation included. That's a huge problem. We have non-linear responses of yields to heat. We have all sorts of massive challenges coming at us. And I think it's really important that we connect what we do to the big picture and see how can we make at country, at regional, at continental level, how can we make this, really, how can we contribute to this rather than each doing our own small thing that creates an island of happiness in an ocean of problems. Yeah, I'd like to leave it at that.
Thank you very much for your reaction, Timo. Very, very important. And thanks for keeping to the time. I want to call on David Laborde from FAO now for his reactions on what he has had and also maybe some reflections on what FAO is doing. David, over to you.
Thanks a lot. No, so for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about what FAO is doing because it can be a long list, but just a little taste. Now, my first point will be to say that we also have to understand how much science can enter in policy making and to have a bit of reality check sometime. I remember the time where we were all happy to say that decisions have to be evidence-based. These days, I start to hear more that it should be evidence-informed. That's already a bit of change. But I also think that, you know, how much geopolitics and how much domestic politics are actually guiding some of the choice that will be done at the end. It's important in order that sometimes, you know, we try to do or to implement a good solution, even if it's not the best solution. That I think it's important. And the point also about, you know, yes, there is a lot of fragmentation when we think about the food, the agri-food system and the climate part, and how it's important to connect the dots in order to deliver things at scale. And these two aspects is actually why at FAO we have introduced 18 months ago the FAO Global Roadmap to achieve food security and nutrition in the context of climate action, because we have seen the need to get a consistent global framework, but at the end to be country-led. And in this context, the way that we are looking at this is that we have one triangle basically to solve in order to deploy solution. One is about policy and governance, and that's also the role of policy cohesion that today is far from being achieved in countries, but also in what the different donors and actors are recommending. The second dimension is the science and evidence. Of course, we have some knowledge. Of course, we can already guide some action, but surprisingly, on very particular questions, there's still knowledge gap. And that's not only true in Africa. I mean, even in Europe, some policy decision today, some policy recommendation are going in the right direction. But when you work with government about, okay, in details, what we are going to ask farmers to do or how we are going to put incentive for farmers, people are still experimenting. So there is investing in science is still needed to make sure we can translate some policy vision into action. And the last part of the triangle is the financing and costing. And really, when we want to scale solution, we have to act on these three things: the policy governance, the science evidence, and the finance and costing at the same time. And I would say we can see this also through the angle of when we try to test or prioritize some of the recommendations we make. They have to be technically adapted. And I will say that where the art science that we already discussed are important. They have to be economically sounded. And that's where economists are important. At the micro level, we talk about the household economics, but also Alan Renison, we're talking about the macro level. So that's important. You know, you have to convince the farmers to adapt. You have to convince a Ministry of Finance to invest. But the third aspect also is the political economy. I cannot stress it enough. understanding the political economy is why it makes, science moving to action. If it is not done, you get things staying on the shelf. And basically, you waste sometimes scientific effort. And I will just conclude to the last point is slightly even after the political economy, there is a question on capacity of implementing. I operate in some African country today where actually the money is not the problem. The capacity is how we can deploy the money at the right time with the government that will have the capacity to own the project and to deploy it. And so, this last leg about policy implementation, that can be seen as very far from the initial science request, is going to be important. Are we developing science that will inform policy, but in policy that can actually be deployed? And that's when you start to understand this value chain of knowledge from knowledge to action, that you can go and scale things up. Because yes, especially to also echo the question on Brazil context, in some countries, if we can get 2 policy reform during the year, or if we can actually implement 2 projects at scale properly, that's the maximum that the country can do. And so when you start to see 5 donors coming with a list of 15 projects or things like that, we know it's going to get stuck. And it's going to be a recipe for failure, create frustration. So just want to reflect, about understanding these different things to be capable to implement and make sure that the investment we do on science will translate into a concrete outcome for the population and for the policymakers. Otherwise, people believe less and less in science, and our decisions become less and less informed by evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, for that. I put in the chat those that I'm going to call next. I'd like to give the floor to Wilhelmina, and after that, Sylvain, we take the floor. Please, if you can stick to 2 minutes, because I think we're running out of time and we'll need to wrap up very soon. And I still want to give, maybe I can say for our panelists, if you just want to have like a minute of closure of your point, I'm still going to give it to you. I'll come back to you. So if you can just wrap it up, and also maybe Professor Van Bon also 1 minute or so. But for Wilhelmina, I want to give the floor to you now.
Okay, so thank you so much for organizing this, and also the bright brains for this discussion, very much on spot. I also want to re-echo the need for us to build capacity, especially in the area of prioritization, because we cannot everything. So we need more mechanisms and tools developed so that we can have the prioritization very right and very more convincing. I also want to re-emphasize the need to encourage co-design of research agendas with our policymakers. We need to involve them very early enough for them to be convinced. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilhelmina, for that. Wilhelmina is with CSIR in Ghana, and it's a pleasure to also have you here join us. Sylvain, I think I want to give the floor to you very quickly.
Yes, thank you. I'll be as quick as I can. I am director at AgriNatura. Well, to try to elaborate somehow on what Alan alluded to in terms of entry points for collaboration in this virtuous triangle: research, donors, policymakers. I think we did not talk enough about the policymakers themselves. We talked a lot about the donors and the funds, but the policymakers are key. They are the ones who are sovereign. And Leonard mentioned a bit about that, talking about the geopolitics of technology. Not every country has the same ideology or willingness to do certain things, and that has to be taken care of. My point is to say also that the term scaling, that academically and conceptually it has been refined a bit better than that. With most governments want first to scale out, meaning to touch a greater number of beneficiaries. Fine. But what Leonard mentioned is also the topic of scaling up. We have how ready are governments to change institutions, regulations, and even ideologies. Some are very pro-GMO, some are very pro-agroecology, some like the whatever technology, some are completely against that. So this is about changing. So taking care of what governments really are ready to do, what are they objective is very important. And also Timo, for instance, alluded to what I would call the scaling deep, meaning what are the real local contexts, what are livelihoods and the conditions of the households, how a technology can be adapted also at the very local level. So how far governments are ready to go and donors are ready to go, and with the support of research. To wrap up all these different dimensions of scaling, I would say that, to me, this virtuous triangle, working together in a collaboration, this could be tied up with theories of change, with causalities of actions linked with causalities, linking to probable consequences, unforeseen consequences, wished consequences, etc. And that leads us to have a very strong monitoring, evaluation, learning system leading to impact assessment. So saying that, I'm just finalizing here to say it would complement what Alan alluded to in terms of modeling and very quantitative approaches, but also complementing with some qualitative perspectives onto what's happening locally, as I said, scaling deep, but also on the institutionalization of things, how far are ready to go governments. These are, to me, a very important element to fuel this triangle: research, donors, and policymakers. Over, thank you.
Thank you, Sylvain, and thank you for being concise with your points. In this regard, I want to then go back to my panelists and have your last sentence for this session. And I want to start with Federica, if you're still with us. Maybe Federica has dropped off. Okay, can I have from Oshani your last thoughts in 1 minute, please? Oshani, please.
Yeah, sorry. Listening to Sylvain just now, even in the most, and picking up from Leonard Mitzi, even in the most fragile environments, entrepreneurship is so abound, so ripe. It's the investment environment that might be failing them. So perhaps the first place to prioritize the conversation between finance ministries, policymakers, science, donors, and philanthropy is investment in science. That's the priority. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much for that, for being concise. Investment in science, I think it is key. Can I have your last words, Helen?
Sure, and thanks again, Daniel, for inviting me to this conversation. I know we're well over time, so I'll be very brief. Just a couple of comments that sprung out to me from going around the group just now. Just on implementation kind of capacity, sort of fitting the science-based recommendations to governments to that implementation capacity kind of reality. I think somebody said there was only kind of room for a government to kind of take on the implementation of maybe a couple of reforms in any given year, which is probably accurate. And so there's, again, it points to the need for kind of disciplined prioritization of what messages are being delivered, not just to the Ministry of Finance, but to perhaps the Ministry of Agriculture or Environment or whoever's actually tasked with implementation on the ground. And then a final thought is tracking implementation. Sylvain mentioned MLE there, but sort of supporting efforts to actually understand what policies are being implemented is pretty important. We're guilty in the policy community of always looking forward and sort of planning and strategizing and prioritizing and modeling and so on, but actually tracking what's happening on the ground in an actionable manner is also really quite critical. So with that, I'll hand back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Alan, for that. Professor Van Braun, your last words for this session?
Well, let me commend you and Daniel and the colleagues who spoke. I want to emphasize 2 points at the end. One is there should be a very strong emphasis on job creation of youth in rural areas. And that needs to have a finance and an education component. these jobs really need to be in value chains and not just on the farms. The finance component, I think, would benefit from a lot more local finance mobilization. The bulk of financing in rural areas does not come from donors. It comes from the rural communities, family and friends. And to incentivize and to strengthen the financial literacy of youth is absolutely critical. The bigger issue on finance relate to financing trade facilitation, which has the highest payoff, according to many studies, of any investments in African agriculture context. So local finance, capacity for youth employment, trade facilitation finance. We need to talk about the what and the how. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Leonard, just 1 minute, please.
So thanks, Daniel. Just the European Union clearly wants to continue playing a leading role, despite all the sort of caveats that I mentioned, including ODA cuts. You know that our response is inspired by the Global Gateway, which is a 360-degree approach where R&I, research and innovation, is at the core. So as Joachim mentioned, TVET is key in terms of the skill sets, the green skills in value chains, typology of value chains, both export, local and regional markets, and clearly with an aim of the continental free trade area. The growth of Africa can only be unleashed if the 55 countries trade more and more integrated, and we create a sort of vision of Africa which has a continental market which can create those jobs and growth that Joachim mentioned. Over.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I see also Paulina from Wageningen University here wrote that what kind of science are we talking about? The type of science that is responsive, inclusive, and mindful of the outcomes that go beyond economic growth and safeguard planetary boundaries. In terms of my last words, I mean, it's been a pleasure being on this and moderating this, and we've raised important points around coordination, around partnership, around capacity, including implementation capacity. Also, there is need for us in terms of strengthening the science policy interface and scaling R&I to better understand geopolitics, and also have and encourage our science, the science community, to have more political economy framing. We've talked about generally about increases in finance, but in this context that we are in, where even finance is shrinking, especially ODA, the need for us to be innovative and embrace innovative ideas around financing. And in terms of doing that also, I think we've stressed the point of prioritization. And the question has been asked that what mechanisms and tools do we have or can we bring on board to better prioritize in terms of what we can do, because we cannot do everything. On this note, I want to actually thank everyone for being part of this, and we are going to continue to engage, and basically we are going to send out a report summarizing the major points that have been raised today. And I want to appreciate everyone for staying on the call. Our panelists, thank you very much for heeding our call, and we continue to engage with you. Thanks, and see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yes.